Thank you so much for joining Unite for Site's webinar about environmental justice. We are thrilled to have all of you with us here today. My name is Jennifer Staples-Clark, and I'm founder and Chief Executive Officer of Unite for Site. I will begin by briefly introducing you to Unite for Site, review the webinar logistics, and then we will hear from our 4 expert panelists. Unite for Site is a global health nonprofit organization that promotes high-quality care for all. We offer extensive global health and social entrepreneurship education programs. Our Global Health University program offers a free webinar series, including today's webinar, and we also offer 20 online certificate programs for students and professionals. Many students receive academic credit for completion of these certificates, and professionals often pursue the certificates for professional development purposes. The certificate topics range from a certificate in global health and a certificate in global health research to a certificate in cultural competency, a certificate in environmental health, and many other certificates as well. We have additional upcoming webinars during October and beyond, and we encourage you to register for these free upcoming webinars at uniteforsite.org/webinars. Our next confirmed webinar is on October 27th from 4 to 5 p.m. Eastern Time, and it is about paths to fulfilling careers in global health. Additional educational opportunities for students and professionals includes participation in Unite for Site's global health and social entrepreneurship events, which focus on responsible global engagement. Our upcoming Global Health and Innovation Conference, the 14th annual event, which is the world's largest global health and social entrepreneurship conference, will be on April 22nd and 23rd, 2017 at Yale University. This conference includes 300 speakers and more than 2,000 participants for a weekend exchange of ideas across all disciplines of global health, international development, and social entrepreneurship. And the conference website, as well as registration, can be seen at uniteforsite.org/conference. This event also includes an annual Global Health and Innovation Prize, which is a $10,000 and a $2,000 cash prize to the 2 best pitch presentations at the Global Health and Innovation Conference. And this prize supports outstanding ideas, programs, and organizations which are locally developed and locally responsible. And applications are accepted on a rolling application basis, and additional details and application instructions can be seen at uniteforsite.org/conference. We additionally have a Social Entrepreneurship Institute occurring at Yale University on December 2nd, 2016, and additional details about that upcoming event can also be seen at uniteforsite.org/institute. In addition to these global health and social entrepreneurship events, we also have healthcare delivery programs that provide care to patients living in extreme poverty. We partner with phenomenal local eye clinics in Ghana, Honduras, and India to provide quality eye care to patients who are unable to access or afford care. These programs are locally led and locally managed by the local medical professionals, and our collaborations have provided eye care to more than 2 million people by local doctors during the past decade, including more than 95,000 site-restoring surgeries by local ophthalmologists. Unite for Site is the world's only organization that is a healthcare delivery organization that also offers immersive global health education and social entrepreneurship opportunities for students and professionals. Participants have the opportunity to support and learn from local doctors in Ghana, Honduras, and India as they provide care to patients living in poverty in villages, slums, and refugee camps. And the participants learn from the local medical professionals about patient barriers to care and about effective strategies to reach the hardest to reach patients who are otherwise unable to access or afford care. And the local doctors are phenomenal social entrepreneurs who design effective and innovative strategies to eliminate patient barriers to care. Now that I've described about Unite for Site, I'll next now describe about the basic logistics of this webinar. We're thrilled to have all of you with us here today, and we have 4 incredible panelists, and they have a wealth of expertise to share with you during this next hour. Each of our panelists today will start by giving a 2-minute introduction about themselves, their current role, and their key guidance and advice regarding environmental justice. Then we will dedicate the remaining time to your questions and answers, and we received many excellent questions from you, our audience, by yesterday's question submission deadline, and we selected the most common and most thoughtful questions to ask our panelists today. We also invite you to submit additional questions in the text box on the left of your webinar screen, and then we'll select those questions to ask the panelists today as well. We also encourage you to tweet during the webinar, and the webinar hashtag is GHUWebinar. You can also see this hashtag in the webinar visuals on your screen. Now we will proceed with having our panelists introduce themselves in alphabetical order. I'm delighted to introduce you to our first panelist, Dean Cycon. Dean, please begin by introducing yourself, your background and current role, and share your key guidance regarding environmental justice.
Thanks, Jennifer. My name is Dean Cycon. I'm the founder and CEO of Dean's Beans Organic Coffee. We've been around for 23 years, and we pretty much pioneered the introduction of international development into the coffee industry back in 1988 when I co-founded Coffee Kids, the first nonprofit development organization in coffee, and then when we integrated it into our business model when we started Dean's Beans in 1993. My background is as an indigenous rights and environmental attorney in the late 70s all through the 80s and into the 90s, and although I don't practice law anymore, I incorporate the techniques and the insights of law into the development work we do, the activism and the advocacy work we do in coffee villages. So one of the biggest lessons learned in all these years of working in community development and especially in environmental justice areas is that environmental justice is such a multifaceted sector, and the issues within it are so interconnected that it's not easy. You can't segregate out one aspect of environmental justice without touching upon all the other things it relates to. We'll be getting into this more later. And so the biggest thing I learned is that these community work has to be approached with immense humility and with an open mind. And from there, you can begin the inquiry. I'll leave it at that for now.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Dean. And Christopher Golden, please introduce yourself and share your key lessons learned as well.
Sure. Thank you, Jennifer. So my name is Chris Golden. I'm a research scientist at the Harvard School of Public Health. I'm also the Associate Director of the Planetary Health Alliance, which is based at Harvard University. The Planetary Health Alliance is a multi-institution consortium with over 40 different members of academia, NGOs, and government agencies that's really dedicated to generating knowledge that looks at the interface of environmental change and human health, creating and curating educational resources for planetary health, and then translating our results into policy action within the sphere of planetary health. My personal background is that I'm an ecologist and epidemiologist. I've been living and working in Madagascar for the past 17 years, and much of my work has really been dedicated to understanding how environmental change impacts human health and how conservation could actually be seen as a public health intervention. And I think that the main lesson that I've learned over time is that with the tremendous changes that we are facing around the planet in terms of environmental degradation, whether this is biodiversity loss, climate change, wildlife population collapses, deforestation, etc., the downstream effects of those processes will have deep and tangible effects on human health, and that the populations that will be most at risk of these changes will be many of the kind of poorer populations that are removed from market infrastructures within the developing world. And so I see this relationship as one of the greatest environmental justice concerns that I'm involved with. And I'll leave it with that. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Christopher. And Rebecca Hardin, please introduce yourself as well and share your key lessons learned. Rebecca, do you still have you on the line? We may have lost her. We'll proceed then to Sasha Kramer. Sasha, please introduce yourself and share your key lessons learned.
Hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here today. My name is Sasha Kramer, and I'm an ecologist and human rights activist who is I was the co-founder and am currently the executive director of Soil, an organization based in Haiti that's been working on the transformation of waste into resources. And we do that through a process called ecological sanitation, where human wastes are converted into compost for agriculture and reforestation. And I actually first came to Haiti in 2004 as a human rights observer. And during my time here, I really realized that really the most pervasive human rights abuse was actually poverty, and the fact that so many people in Haiti don't have access to basic services to meet their needs. So I also began to think a lot about how poverty is related to environmental degradation and how the poor are disproportionately exposed to environmental risks. And I think that something I'd like to get into a little bit more during this webinar is the recent hurricane that just hit Haiti and how that relates to environmental justice. So I'm very happy to be here with you all today, and I will say that my mind is certainly with the south of Haiti right now, where we're coordinating relief efforts. But I also wanted to add that one of the lessons that I really learned about environmental justice when coming to Haiti, and something that I think really surprised me, was the fact that basic services are not only more easily accessible to the rich, they're actually much cheaper to the rich as well. So an example of that would be that in wealthier neighborhoods in Haiti, the government actually provides trash collection services free of charge, whereas if you go into poorer communities, in order for people to find access to a trash collection service, they would actually need to pay for that. And it's very similar with clean water. People who live in wealthier neighborhoods have access to piped water that's been treated. People living in poor neighborhoods have to buy treated water. So I think that for me, this was something very shocking about environmental justice that I learned. And I would say that my sort of key message would be for people working in development that it's very important when you're thinking about the type of work you want to do, that you ensure that the standards that you're trying to attain for that work are the very same standards that you would set for yourself. So thank you very much, and I look forward to speaking with everyone.
Terrific. Thank you so much, Sasha. And Rebecca Hardin, do we have you back on the line now? Then we don't quite have her on the line. Hopefully we'll be able to get her back on. Now we'll proceed with our questions. Thank you so much to all of our panelists. As you heard, they have a wealth of expertise and guidance to share with you today. As mentioned, we received many questions in advance from you, our audience members. And if you have additional questions, please post them in the text box on the left of your webinar screen. So to begin with our first question for actually all of our panelists, and Dean, perhaps you can begin. How do you work with local communities to make sure that you are being culturally sensitive? Is there anything that you and your team try to do to give back to the communities you're working with? And what recommendations do you have for people doing work in communities which are not one's own?
Well, that's certainly not one question, and it could certainly lead to hours and hours of wonderful discussion from everybody, but I'll take a crack at it. We have a very formal formal structure for dealing with new communities, and what it is we use what's now called an appreciative inquiry approach. Basically, once we start connecting with communities, it takes about a year before we really try to implement anything or get something started. We take a year to learn who the folks are that we're starting to buy coffee from, to have lots of community meetings to get a sense of what the developmental priorities and the roadblocks to justice are in those communities. And only after that and trying to understand the cultural dynamics of the community do we then say, okay, we're ready to address one of the issues that you've identified, and that's actually our business model. And from there, and this goes to giving back, our business model is that in every community we buy coffee from, we engage in a relationship of activism, advocacy, and people-centered development. as part of what I call trade justice. And so the community may say, you know, we really feel that the biggest inhibition to going forward here is the fact that we have no income. And so we may look to create income-generating programs. Or it may be that because an earlier USAID-funded program deforested our major valleys, we're suffering from terrible runoff problems, loss of wildlife, all the things inherent in deforestation. And so we look at creating a community-based reforestation program. Every one of the programs we set up is funded by us. We don't go and get funds from government or Clinton or any of the other foundations, because this is a new business model. So all of our programs are funded by our sales of coffee and cocoa and sugar and other things. But the real kicker for us is that the management of the programs is by the communities. So we may bring in external trainers or other external resources, but the community itself controls and manages the program. So they own it, they operate it, they're vested in its success, and we then touch and go lightly to it because it's not our project, it's their project. So that's how we work in different communities. So it's a little easier to be sensitive when you're not trying to impose a model or a program or a style of doing business or a style of management on people. So that's the short answer to that.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dean. And I believe we have Rebecca Hardin on the line now. Is that right, Rebecca?
Yes, I'm here. Can you hear me okay?
Okay. Yes, we can hear you. Wonderful. So perhaps if you can please introduce yourself, your current role, your key guidance, and then also if you can respond to the same question that we're asking all the panelists. How do you work with local communities to make sure to be culturally sensitive? Is there anything that you and your team try to do to give back to the communities you are working in? And what recommendations do you have for people doing work in communities which are not one's own?
Sure. My name is Rebecca Hardin. I'm a faculty member at the School of Natural Resources and Environment at the University of Michigan. And my training is in cultural anthropology and social anthropology. I actually was one of Jennifer Staples' professors when she was an undergraduate and have benefited so much from watching her build models at Unite for Sight for exactly the kind of collaborative work I feel is needed in these sectors. That's a delight to me. I will say that now in my teaching, I work at the interface of resource management, governance, and community development defined in various ways. My colleagues at the Environmental Justice Program at Michigan are among the pioneers of that academic field. My mentors included Bunyan Bryant, Dorceta Taylor, Paul Mohai, many of whom were present at the inception of environmental justice as a field of study based largely on the science of exposure to toxins and health risks among minority communities in the United States. I would say my major insights for my work now in interdisciplinary teams has to do with the fact that environmental justice itself has moved in 2 or 3 interesting ways in recent years. One, it is no longer only limited to the not in my backyard social causes of the United States where it first took shape. It is becoming a truly transnational and global movement, and I know that we'll be addressing that later in the webinar. 2, it is moving from a focus on the risk of exposure to bad things to a focus on the capacity of people to enjoy good things that bring health and prosperity and well-being. So, for example, the question of displacement of people from protected areas becomes as important an environmental justice question as exposure to pollution or toxins. And 3, I would argue that environmental justice is finding more and more productive interfaces for the collaborations needed between legal scholars, epidemiologists, chemists, and others, each of whose work is important for shaping the way we understand health at community and even individual levels. And I think that's a very exciting thing. As for the work with communities we do, I will talk perhaps most specifically about my recent work in Gabon on the grounds of the Albert Schweitzer Hospital in Lambaréné. Can you hear me okay still?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Yes.
In that particular project, one of the things we did was to initiate our work through several months of preliminary consultation with communities about what kinds of issues, technologies, health challenges, and so on had relevance for them. We also worked within communities to identify leaders who were more than merely administrative leaders, for instance, chiefs, but also appeared to be genuine social leaders. Perhaps these were women or younger people in the community. But that gave us a better sense of how to choose delegates for wider regional workshops and how to define priorities for our interface as a university with those communities based on some of their own concerns. Finally, after we ran workshops last May in Lambarene, we've done extensive follow-up through semi-structured interviews and continued research in villages to see whether there are actual follow-up consequences, positive or negative, from the technologies and health issues that we worked on with communities and educators in Gabon. So I would say that the consultative research tools, participatory research processes, can be applied to basic kinds of elements of development and research processes like workshops to improve their relevance. And yes, absolutely, I agree with the previous speaker, the sense of ownership and having set an agenda together that communities may have in these processes.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Rebecca. And Christopher Golden, if you can also please respond to the same question about how you work with local communities and your focus on cultural sensitivity.
Sure, thank you. I think that the best way that I've approached working with local communities is really by embedding myself within the community and having many of my research questions be generated by local community members. And I think that in that way, I can ensure that all of the results that are created by my research and kind of our larger research group is then channeled into something that is useful and meaningful to these communities. And I think that that takes on different nuances. I think that what Dean said was really important, that we need to really be humble when we go into these settings and make sure that we're not bringing in our own priorities and our own prerogatives to force our own research agenda into these areas, but to really have it be something that is a living and breathing and dynamic body of research. And I think that the question around giving back is something that is interesting and something that I've grappled with over time. And being someone whose primary function is research and not someone who is doing active interventions or different sorts of public health trials, I often feel tremendous guilt that we're not doing enough to give back to the communities that we're working with. And so we try to do small things along the way. But this is kind of a question that I would love to hear everybody else answer so that perhaps I can learn from them.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And our final panelist, Sasha, you can also please share your thoughts and insight regarding this question about cultural sensitivity.
Sure, I'd be happy to. And it's wonderful to go after these other panelists because I think each of them brought up really great points that I wanted to touch on. Dean really talked a bit about the importance of taking time to get to know the community. And I think that certainly for Soil, that was a very important part of the way we began our work in Haiti, because when I first came, I didn't come to Haiti as an ecologist who wanted to build composting toilets. I was lucky enough to come in a very different capacity, which I think sort of allowed me to come into the community with a much more open mind and with time to really listen to what it was that people found most challenging, and to sort of build the program based off what we were hearing from local communities. Another really important thing I heard from Rebecca was this idea of looking for more than just administrative leaders, but really looking for people who are respected within their community as real community activists. And I think that this has been a really important part of our hiring policy at Soil, is that instead of just reviewing the way that people look on paper, looking at their CVs, looking at their education and hiring based on that, really the most important factor that we look at when we're bringing on a new staff member is, how are you viewed by your community? Are you someone that respects those around you, and are you someone that engenders respect of others? And that's really the most important thing, because we feel that those other skills that you might need, skills like computer skills, language skills, these are things that people can develop over time, but really a true leader, that true leadership potential is something that's much harder to develop in a person. So we really look to have the upper level management at Soil be people who have been community mobilizers for a very long time. And that means that if we move into a new community, they're sort of the face of Soil that's seen, are these people who have a lot of experience with community activism. And then I wanted to touch on Chris's research point because prior to starting Soil, I was a research scientist, and I continue to be very engaged in and excited about really using research to make sure that our interventions have been rigorously tested and are actually valuable. And so we work with a lot of research partners, and it has meant sort of bringing in a lot of people into communities who are coming specifically to do a research project. And two of the things that we've found most useful in terms of giving back have been really to ensure that the researchers are always presenting their results, not only disseminating them internationally, but really sharing them with the communities in which we work and making sure that that's translated into the local language and a lot of chances for discussion about what that research means. And then the other thing has been developing the research capacity of our staff. So getting our staff excited about research, really together learning more about the experimental process, and then also creating opportunities for them to travel and maybe, visit some of the labs that we've worked with in the United States so that they can see that research firsthand and so that it feels like more of an exchange and less of us just bringing researchers in. So that was something that came to my mind when you brought up that question, Chris. Thanks.
Wonderful. Thank you, Sasha. And another question actually for you, Sasha. How do you educate communities about sanitation and why they should build toilets while being culturally sensitive and maintaining cultural humility?
Yeah, well, I think that an interesting thing for me, and this also surprised me a little bit because I think that a lot of the global dialogue around sanitation right now has to do with behavior change and really sort of convincing people of the importance of sanitation. And I think that what I have found overwhelmingly in Haiti is that people are very aware of the importance of sanitation. I think more so in Haiti right now because of the cholera epidemic that's been going on for the last 4 years. I think that's made people really aware of the public health importance of sanitation. But I would say that just from a human dignity perspective, particularly in urban areas, it would be very rare, if ever, that I would find anyone who would actually choose to not have a toilet when they needed one. So I think that the sort of global dialogue around behavior change is in my view, at least in the Haitian context, is misguided. I think that the issue has more been about access, affordability, and appropriate technologies that will work in different types of communities. But for the most part, selling the idea of having a private place to go to the bathroom is not a hard sell. I find that everyone wants that. They just don't know how to get access to that.
May I make a comment on the back of that?
Yes, please, Dean.
Sure.
Thank you, Sasha. That's great. We've done a number of, I hate to say this, but latrine projects, for lack of a better word, but in Peru and in Mexico. And interestingly, when we started to investigate what people were doing and how organizations were doing it, it was pretty much a standard around the global south that organizations would come in and pour a concrete kind of a slab with a hole in it and build some walls around it and call it, a latrine. So when we started bringing, sort of a facilitated inquiry method into communities and talking to people about this issue among the menu of issues that people wanted to talk about, what we found and we instituted in Peru was people actually wanted a toilet that had dignity to it, and they felt that the slab cement thing, although it was functional, sort of reinforced that you're poor and, okay, you don't have to take a dump in a sitting off a log over a hole, which happens in a lot of communities, but this is better. But it still didn't have any sense of dignity. It was sort of a, here's what the nice people from the north are going to give you. And so we were told in no uncertain terms that if we were going to get involved in constructing bathrooms, toilets, that they needed to have dignity. And so we let folks take designs on what things would look like. And, you know, I've got a couple pictures on the web. They look like Hilton Hotel bathrooms. People really wanted dignified places to go to the bathroom. And it was really interesting because it changes, as we were talking about earlier, it shifts from we're giving you this thing that we think you need and you've agreed that you need, but it comes to you on our terms, to how does this support you both technologically in a way that acknowledges your inherent human dignity. You design it. And so that's been wonderful and a wonderful education for everybody involved. I just wanted to share that story.
Fantastic insight. Thank you so much, Dean and Sasha. And the next question for Rebecca. The environmental justice movement is well documented and has a lot of traction and support in the U.S. Can you speak to the environmental justice movement on a global scale?
I would be happy to, Jennifer. Thank you for asking. I want to make sure you can hear me again, as I am on travel.
Yes,
so
we can hear you.
Thank you for your patience. I will try to be succinct about this. I would argue that what's happening is actually more of an effervescence of experiences of environmental conflict and exposure from around the world that are kind of increasingly articulating with each other. So it would be a mistake to claim that the environmental justice movement originated in the U.S. and is moving transnationally. However, it is the case that I have had a lot of interest from scholars abroad in the coherence and limited but palpable sort of victories that the EJ movement has been able to have in the United States. For instance, the executive order signed under Bill Clinton. And so there is a fascination with the U.S. trajectory, and there's a lot of learning happening now between U.S.-based movement history and emerging notions of environmental justice from other places in the world. One project that has facilitated that and tried to build platforms for that is a project funded by the European Union recently, the EJOLT project. That's a project called Environmental Justice Organization, Liability, and Trade. And they have focused on several subsets of environmental conflicts, including mining and energy and water-related conflicts around the world. One thing we've been able to do here is to try to help them develop more rigorous methods for mapping environmental conflicts using both online surveys and in-depth literature reviews, and in fact developing survey tools that could work through something like the Environmental Protection Agency's blog to elicit expertise about environmental conflicts both from lay people and from academic experts, so that the maps that EJOLT has generated, and you can find them online at ejatlas.org. They have created a digital interactive environmental justice atlas with points on maps from many parts of the world. And if you pull that atlas up, you can go into each point and see what were the communities involved in the conflict, what was the nature of the conflict, what kinds of resources were involved. It's our hope that that would be a research tool, but also a tool for activists and for those engaged in social change-making on these issues. However, we're very mindful of the need for research itself to inform these kinds of tools in whatever ways can be most rigorous and make them most useful, most easily updated, and cross-checked. I think that challenge of making research itself careful enough to keep up with and back up advocacy is non-negligible. And I'll give you one more example of that from the Flint water crisis. There has been a remarkable kind of proliferation of collaborative relationships among academic institutions here in Michigan to address the Flint water crisis. That's something with which I believe many of you are familiar, involving lead, but also other contaminants in the water flowing out of taps for residents of Flint, Michigan. This was due largely to negligence on the part of the state, various state agencies, in monitoring water quality and communicating about water quality when the source of that city's water was changed to a nearby river from its original configuration. Now those organizations working on that challenge, although they mean very well, are having trouble ensuring that they are careful enough with household samples and water quality work to prevent the research that is intended to help people from further actually creating problems for households in terms of their abilities to obtain insurance, for example, medical insurance, right? So this speaks to the kind of issues I spoke of earlier, where you need a sense of both legal and medical and ecological and epidemiological and engineering knowledge to try to make progress on an issue without inadvertently damaging the very communities we're seeking to help. I believe international tools like the EJ Atlas and emerging best practice journals of record are popping up. I think this is an exciting moment for that work, but I will say I think there are many, many challenges ahead of us.
Wonderful. Thank you, Rebecca. And another question for you, Rebecca. What do you see as some of the greatest injustices in the conservation and sustainability field, both internationally and domestically?
That is a really, really big question, and I appreciate that you're asking it in two ways: injustices in the conservation world on the one hand, and injustices in the sustainability world on the other. To take conservation initially, I would start by saying that it is the case that conservation itself as a conceit and an endeavor was erected on a base of cultural arrogance in many respects. There are built-in what we might call biases, implicit biases in this day and age, right, in the conservation endeavor. Historically, it was very linked to imperial and colonial expansion. It was linked to the anxiety experienced by empires when things like wood for ship masts ran out in the forests of Europe, for example, or the forests of New England, and we were forced to look elsewhere for natural resources. That anxiety about resources not being infinite was part of the creation of protected areas and conservation zones under colonial administrations, and those early injustices, which did not recognize the land use and access and rights of indigenous peoples, have in some ways threaded through subsequent efforts, and there have been earnest efforts to make conservation more equitable, more respectful of indigenous rights, and more just. I think that where we are now, we have a pretty robust set of scientific debates about displacement for conservation and the creation of protected areas. At the same time, we also have advocates for protected areas who recognize that the amplitude of challenges to wildlife populations in this day and age, and that, the gravity of the situation for many, many communities, both rural human communities and animal communities, cannot allow us to throw the baby out with the bathwater. Conservation must continue in some way. It must be an ongoing effort, but it must not only address those historical injustices, but also more recent injustices involved with state formation, the expansion of post-colonial states into conservation areas, and also the ways in which, in spite of conservation efforts, both here and abroad, elites have long had privileged ability to use resources for their own wealth accumulation, while others have experienced nothing but constraints. So I would say displacement of peoples remains a major, major issue from the very beginnings until today in conservation. At the same time, someone like Martha Nussbaum has argued forcefully that the frontiers of justice in our time lie with considerations of species rights, mobility, and disability. And I think that those are powerful frontiers, and that the reconciliation of animal rights with human rights remains one of the more interesting challenges in conservation. For sustainability, you could make a similar point. Elites have privileged access to technologies, new and old, All too often, we see people who have struggled to innovate for a bit of solar power on their own farm or in their own fields, and this is equally true here in the U.S. as well as abroad. When it comes down to a more lucrative solar sector, somehow the big utilities manage to carry the day. And so the question of who innovates and keeps technological diversity alive, right? Those are very different people than those who profit from many of the new green technologies that are emerging. Van Jones and other popular cultural figures have made these arguments, right? We cannot be green if we are not being just and if we are not providing access to technologies more equitably across rural and urban communities, rather than allowing green tech to become a kind of elite sector where a very few are making a great deal of money. So those are two issues I would raise in those two sectors. I'm trying to be brief.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And Dean, what injustices have you seen in your work, including with farmers?
Whew, a lot. But I think that in keeping with Rebecca's analysis, I think there's a common thread in all the injustices that I'll enumerate in a minute, and the common thread is a dynamic of resource colonization. So whether it's, and I've fought as a lawyer and as a community organizer in coffee communities and indigenous communities that don't have coffee around the world for a long, long time, whether it's oil and gas or gold mining, deforestation, theft and abuse of water sources, theft and abuse of land. It usually comes down to a resource colonization that's authorized and supported by the national entity. It's not just the multinational community of business that's doing this. It's promoted and supported by national entities and state entities on the local level, and it's usually the largely indigenous populations around the world that suffer the consequences of a resource extraction through this process. So, I could give you stories on each of these things till the cows come home, but at the end of the day, that's what we're talking about, is basically a hierarchical system of resource colonization that's been around forever and doesn't look like it's being challenged. And environmental justice people around the world, whether it's the landless workers movement or Via Campesina or any of a dozen other groups I've worked with, they know what's going on and work hard, but don't have a lot of resources and the structures of power and control that dictate who gets access to land, who gets access to water. At this point, it's still based on these old models of colonial and kind of post-colonial structures of governance. So until those change, and there are lots of people working on this, until those change, we're all still, sort of fighting these actions against, rather than proactively being able to create our own systems of control. So one of the things I do with indigenous communities is help try to write land use protocols so that indigenous land use can be acknowledged and protected under national law, rather than the presumption that it doesn't exist, that this is terra nullius, as they said in the days of Columbus. Nobody lives there. So there's a lot of great work to be done on the community side in fighting back against this kind of resource colonization. But to me, it's the major dynamic at play.
Great. Thank you so much, Dean. And Christopher, how have you seen overfishing impacting human health, and what are some possible solutions, especially for vulnerable populations?
Yeah, I think that question kind of fits in nicely with what Rebecca and Dean have just been speaking about in terms of the control over resources and the role of conservation or the role of government. And I think that this is really a major environmental justice issue, and I think that it's interesting to think about the ways in which conservation can intervene in either a positive or negative way to either prevent people to have access from these resources or to protect the resources in the short term to then help deliver more abundant resources in the long term. And of course, that latter scenario relies on an equitable and democratic system of conservation, which, as we well know, is not always structured and in place. But I think that it's a mistake to have these conversations in the absence of also talking about these other threats that also kind of mediate people's access to resources. So for the fishing specifically, I see the development and proliferation of locally managed marine areas where the devolution of rights from national government control to local community administered is something that is a very hopeful prospect. I'm not sure that it has been perfectly well established and run to date, but I think that the concept behind it is a really wonderful idea to allow local communities the rights to steward their own resources, because these people have been living there for millennia and know these resources and the patterns of these resources better than anyone. And so I think that the lessons that I've learned from my research is that there's truly a threat right now with the decline in fishery resources. Many estimates have been saying that fish catch peaked in 1996 and have been declining by around 1.2 million metric tons per year. And of course, this is not felt evenly around the globe, that with climate change and fisheries moving and migrating poleward, there will be less and less fish caught around that equatorial belt around the world. And these are the very same regions that face the greatest amounts of food insecurity. And so I think that over time, with climate synergies and the synergies of industrial fish poaching, the risk of local communities to not have a kind of well-balanced, nutritious diet, particularly communities that have a heavy reliance on fish, that risk is going to increase. And so I think it's really interesting to think of ways in which sustainable management of fisheries or fishery management improvements or marine conservation areas or locally managed marine areas could actually serve as some sort of public health intervention, obviously in concert with other sorts of development and economic initiatives.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Christopher. And Sasha, Haiti has seen many natural and man-made disasters in recent years, including hurricanes, an earthquake, and a cholera epidemic, including the most recent hurricane. How do these natural and man-made disasters relate to issues of environmental justice?
Thanks very much for asking that question, Jennifer. I think that this is something that has certainly very much been on my mind in the past days as I watched the way the National Preparedness Campaign for the hurricane went. I think that over the last 10 years, 4 of Haiti's largest cities have been nearly wiped out by natural disasters. And these were big hurricanes, so it was a significant earthquake, but really the reason these cities have been leveled is because people are forced to live in very unsafe environmental conditions. So there's not good laws or support for people governing where they live. A lot of people are living on the edge of ravines that flood very easily. They don't have access to building materials that would allow them to live in a secure home. And so I think that while these would have been large disasters anywhere, the impact that Haiti is experiencing is very much an environmental justice issue. And it is the fact that the poor are often forced to live in very unsafe conditions. And I think that the cholera epidemic is actually a very interesting one in the sense that cholera has now been formally acknowledged by the United Nations that they were responsible for bringing cholera to Haiti. And the way that it actually started was that there was a UN base in Haiti that had a sanitation system in place that would not have met UN standards almost anywhere else in the world. It was a leaking latrine that was leaking into one of the rivers, and there was a Nepalese battalion there who had come from an area where cholera was endemic. So when they came to Haiti, there were people who were not sick but who were carrying the disease, and that waste got into the river. And because of the lack of infrastructure and sanitation, it spread incredibly rapidly. So right now, Haiti's experiencing by far the largest and most virulent cholera epidemic in recent global history. And since 2010, over 10,000 people have died from cholera. And I think that it's interesting and extremely sad in the sense that the cause of this was the UN really not respecting their own standards. Perhaps because they were in a country like Haiti where they felt that the standards were very low to begin with, so there was no reason to do that. But I think that's a really important lesson for the world in terms of, really, no matter where you are, you need to maintain the same standards to the extent that you can. And certainly the United Nations had the resources to put in place a good sanitation system. The other thing is the fact that 10,000 people have died. I mean, cholera is a deadly disease, but it's a disease that kills people who don't have access to clean water. So once again, this was a devastating disaster and would have been anywhere that it spread, but certainly in communities where people have means and have available water, you would not have seen nearly the death toll. So I think that sadly, Haiti really provides an example of the environmental justice risks of natural and man-made disasters.
Great. Thank you so much, Sasha. And Dean, can you comment on the interplay between development initiatives that empower smallholder farmers and the plight of ecosystems in those same areas? And also, what makes the direct development program successful, and how can other companies incorporate this type of model? So, two-part question.
Mm-hmm. Could you repeat the first part? I just got so focused on the second.
Comment on the interplay between development initiatives that empower smallholder farmers and the plight of ecosystems in those same areas.
Okay. As I've said several times, we work almost exclusively with indigenous communities around the world and indigenous farming communities. The folks make their living off the land. They're incredibly sensitive to the ecological issues in their communities, be it invasion by miners or deforestation, or right now rust, a climate change-induced disease, which is just raging through Central and now South America and destroying considerable areas of coffee. The figure is 30% in Guatemala, 30% in Colombia, 20% in Peru. But that's sort of an academic figure that doesn't tell you the reality that many farms have lost 100% of their crop, and the trees are destroyed, and they won't see any income for 5 to 6 years, since their 100% of their income comes from coffee. So, these farmers are incredibly sensitive to the environmental issues, ecological issues, including migratory bird habitat. I remember the first time I went down to talk about migratory bird habitat in Guatemala in 1990, and farmers laughed and said, "Don't you think we know that? We don't need the Smithsonian to tell us about migratory bird habitat. We live here." So people are very much aware, maybe not aware of the scientific and technical issues involved, but very much aware of the ecological impacts. So I think that in our case, the cooperatives that we work with are very eager to address ecological issues. And P.S., fishing is part of that. I've been involved in fishing for as long as I've been involved with coffee, so I was really excited to hear what's happening with the Planetary work that you guys are doing, Chris. So, there's no problem of community engagement there. One quick example, in working in the Ecuadorian Amazon to combat oil and gas exploration in indigenous communities, my role there was I took the existing environmental impact statement that the oil and gas company, International Oil and Gas Company, had created, and I simply went through it and described it, because who in an indigenous community reads an 85-page document? Who in our communities do, right? Went through the document basically section by section and asked questions about how would a road that goes through your hunting area impact your ability to find animals. Really basic and relationship of the impact to the environment. And people had no problem comprehending it, understanding it, and then turning around and voting to give back the money they were given and void the contract, which was a very powerful statement from a small indigenous community. So I think people, once they're given resources and information, have no problem engaging very successfully and wholeheartedly in environmental and ecological issues. The second half of why our development programs are so successful, some of them aren't. You know, I've never been anything but transparent about what's worked and what's not worked. But the successful ones, and some of them have been going on for 20 years, are when the community is fully mobilized, fully engaged, and the resources are there to achieve the goal that they're trying to achieve, and it's a reasonable goal. So that may sound very generic, but it isn't. That's what guides us. And so I think that the last part of that question, which is what I've been struggling with for 20 years, is how to get other people to do what we do. We don't try to keep it to ourselves. We have interns. We have a very robust internship program, which I invite anybody to look at and contact me about in several countries, from Asia to Africa to Latin America. I've spoken at so many high-level UN meetings and Global Compact meetings and invited everybody from Coca-Cola to Telecom Italia to send people with us and see how we interact with communities. You know, why is Coke taking all the water out of so many communities and not listening to concerns? You know, and why don't they figure out a way, or, you know, why is Rio Tinto zinc really destroying large parts of West Papua or Papua New Guinea with mining operations without any sensitivity to communities, and then wondering why people are in a physical revolt. So we've made the invitation. I lecture a lot, and I think a lot of small companies around the United States especially, and a lot of fair trade companies, have taken some of the lessons we've learned and integrated them, but it's really plain and simply about commitment. If any organization, whether it's a nonprofit organization or a for-profit organization, wants to integrate direct development into their work, it's really a matter of opening up your mind and saying, wow, we can do this. Corporations with hierarchy and structure generally aren't open-minded enough to do that. Smaller, nimble organizations are, but there are a lot of small organizations around the country and in Europe doing just what we're doing, you know, on maybe a smaller or a different scale. So it's not, we've just had the courage to go out and do it. It's not that we've done anything that other people haven't toyed with or explored from either an academic or another avenue, but we've kind of just pulled it all together and made it our business model. So I don't think it's at all problematic for people. It's just a matter of commitment.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Dean. And a question for Christopher. What are your key lessons learned regarding the importance of the human environment and animal relationship, and what are the best ways to communicate this to a lay audience?
I think that's probably the trickiest question of all of my work. I think that much of the research that I've done has come at some of these relationships in a slightly different angle. Many of the ways that people see that relationship, particularly regarding human-wildlife interaction and human-wildlife interaction specifically focused around bushmeat, is to think about zoonoses and transmission of diseases. And I think that the work that I do is really focused on the incredible nutritional role that bushmeat serves to local communities in the developing world and the ways in which humans rely on this as a food source. And I think that is the area that then brings conservation into tension, because it is at once a disease threat, but also a nutritional benefit. It's something that conservationists want to protect so that they can protect biodiversity, but local people need it in terms of a food source. And so it's this very complicated relationship and a difficult one to navigate. And I think then it's really an issue of risk mitigation. Is the Ebola epidemic, as absolutely horrible as it was, causing a greater health toll than the millions of people around the world that rely on bushmeat as a nutritional resource? And without it, what will happen to those people? And so I think it brings in this really interesting dynamic of what we should do to either supplement diets, to operate conservation in concert with certain types of development initiatives, to progress forward with certain types of economic development so that local people don't have to rely on bushmeat as a food source, but then also these kind of rights issues and right to food issues come into play. And if people truly prefer this as a food source, how do we then go about operating these different types of initiatives and interventions? And so much of what I've learned has been focused on trying to balance the story from a local person's perspective as to why wildlife is so important to the health of indigenous and local people.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Christopher. And our final question for Rebecca. Bees are on the decline in recent years. What should be done immediately, and how could this issue have been avoided, and how is the current Zika spraying further compounding this issue?
Yeah, thank you for that question. It's a very timely one, and it points to the kind of ironies of how one, and I think in many ways it picks up right where the last answer left off from Chris. I mean, he contrasted the Ebola outbreak with this much broader structural question of nutrition and well-being at a much wider scale. And there's a similar story to be told about Zika. One public health intervention may be working on one scale, but it may be playing into a much broader set of health challenges. I think that's what's happening with our bees. I should say that in my work, I've been doing more and more work in audio and in multimedia. I think that not only is one of the biggest justice challenges in human-animal or human-insect relationships equity of access, but also access to information. So the point about, who reads 85 pages of anything anymore is really key. And I do a radio show weekly with students, which is also a digital media platform. I really love it. Last week I had the privilege of hosting several urban beekeepers, one from Philadelphia, several from the Detroit area, and they were talking about this. They were talking about the difficulties that the bee colony collapse disorder, which is a multifactorial problem involving pesticides and mites and the quality and diversity of food sources and landscape-level processes, right? But that makes it even harder for bees to adapt to something like spraying of insecticides for Zika. To address that specific question, I'll repeat something they said on air, which is that, the Zika spraying, actually, if it happens, and if it must happen, and perhaps it must, at least one could think about timing. Some of the Zika spraying is happening midday. That's when worker bees are out of their hives foraging, and that makes its toll especially heavy. Obviously, spraying insecticide on a food base or in a habitat is difficult for bees who are already struggling under the burden of diminishing biodiversity, increasing mite and disease pressure, as well as the presence of insecticides and pesticides in the environment, and indeed climate change and other factors. So, it compounds the problem, but it's really radical. They're talking about sustaining very heavy losses, especially urban beekeepers, who were just reaching a point where they were seeing bees come back into the sort of imaginaries of urban residents and become part of city landscapes in new ways. So I think these are some of the challenges, and again, dialogue across actors and agencies and decision makers about if we must do this, at least can we do it in a way that gives bees a chance. They're very adaptive bees. They've adapted to many things. Maybe if we simply time the spraying in some ways or limit it to a certain threshold, they can have a chance to adapt. But it's really quite a challenge, and I do think that it's a primordial one because it's so linked to our food security. Bees pollinate so much of the food we eat, and indeed they make up so much of biodiversity as a whole. Diversity within the bees is greater than that of all the rest of living organisms put together almost. And so these are really big questions, and they point to the complex systems side of all this. I'd like to see us all getting better and better, as you're facilitating today, Jennifer, at breaking down that complex science into terms that allow more kinds of learners and more kinds of public a way into these scientific debates, because it's going to require a lot of citizen science and a lot of engagement from many different kinds of people for us to get these questions right in the medium to long term.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Rebecca. And thank you to all of our panelists for a phenomenal conversation today. Thank you to everyone.
Yep, have a good night.
Thank you. Take care, everyone.
Thanks, Jennifer. Thanks for.
Thank you. Have a good day.
It's a great conversation.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Really excellent panelists. Thanks.
Yeah. Want to see you all soon. Take care.